Hello, my name is David Prentice. This is Chapter 10 of Introduction to General Science from a Christian Perspective. We've talked about physics, chemistry, biology, a little bit of microbiology, and I wanted to go into a little bit about the fossil record because many Christians are very deceived about what's contained in the fossil record, and they think that somehow it proves evolution. So let me tell you again about myself. I have a bachelor's in physics, a master of education in curriculum and instruction, a master of arts and science teaching, a master's plus 30, and I'm also certified to teach physics, chemistry, biology, general science, which includes earth science, and mathematics. So I was a classroom teacher for many years, and when I was approached to do this class, I sort of jumped at it. So you can find these materials on my website, which is creationorevolution.net, www.creationorevolution.net. And you look at the top of the page, there's a link that says Creation Science Lessons, US and Overseas. Also, of course, since this is through the Legacy Ministry College, you'll find the materials on the Legacy Ministry College Moodle. On that website, there's a great deal more than what I can present here. I wrote a book for this, and it's over 200 pages, I believe, and it goes into a whole lot more detail than what I can do here. So please, by all means, if you want to know more, then go to either of those websites, creationevolution.net or Legacy Ministry College Moodle. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. I want to talk about the fossil record, and this is called Introduction to the Fossil Record. People can spend decades studying paleontology, so I'm not going to give you a complete picture. This is going to be a very short picture of what's in the fossil record. So the first question is, what is a fossil? What is a fossil? Fossils are the preserved remains of dead things. They may consist of an entire organism, parts of it, traces of it, such as worm burrows, footprints, skin impressions, and so forth. So, how do we know what actually happened in the past? We can make up all the stories we want, but fossils furnish the only tangible evidence of what actually did occur in the distant past. But they don't come with written instructions telling us what they mean. We have to interpret them according to our presuppositions. Remember, creation would say initial complexity, from complex to simple. Evolution says initial disorganization, from simple to complex. The things we call empirical sciences, like chemistry and physics and so forth, those can be tested by experimentation. We can't do that with the so-called historical sciences like paleontology and historical geology. All we can do is look for what seems to be the most reasonable explanation. So first, let me show you that there's a number of different types of fossils. If I can blow this up a little bit, maybe not. There we go. And the background picture you see, those are pictures that I took myself in various museums around the world. Here we go, here we go. Blow it up. I guess that's as big as it's going to get. Okay, fossils can be an entire organism, and there are an incredible number of fossils that have been found in the world, or they can be parts of an organism. For instance, this is a part of a dinosaur femur, a leg bone. I got this one up in Wyoming at the Lance Creek Formation. And if you ever want to do something really fun, go to the Lance Creek Formation. Every year, Southwest Adventist University in Dallas does a dig up there, and you're guaranteed you are going to find some dinosaur fossils. Then you can also have something that's part of an organism. So, like, this is a Tyrannosaurus rex tooth. Let's see if I can get it to not puncture me in the head. It's a Tyrannosaurus rex tooth. It's about 6 inches long. Somebody found this and they made a cast of it. And you can buy these things at various types of places. And you can also get complete organisms. You can get little pieces and parts. And here's one of my favorite fossils, which is not actually a fossil. When I went to Durban, South Africa, I have a friend named Joshua Gilbert, the fisherman in Durban. Let's see if I can get the hand to do this correctly. The fishermen in Durban will go down to the harbor, and instead of fishing sinkers, they will use spark plugs, old spark plugs, and they tie them on the line and they throw them out in the water to try to catch various types of fish. Well, my friend Joshua Gilbert, sometimes they snag on the rocks and the line breaks. So my friend Joshua Gilbert gave me this. He went swimming down in the harbor at Durban, South Africa, and he brought me some fossil spark plugs. Technically, these are not fossils, but they look just like fossils. Some of the characteristics of fossils are very often that they're completely mineralized. Of course, they can also be traces and they could be parts of an organism. So I like to say that this particular fossil is from the early Flintstone days before they had invented starters in their automobiles, back when Fred had to put his feet down through the bottom. And if you've never seen that, go watch the Flintstones. So fossils don't tell us anything directly. What we have to do is interpret them according to our presuppositions. There are two major sets of presuppositions. One of them is that things were already complex at the beginning. I call this, it's creation, but I call it initial complexity to make sure there's no confusion. So at the beginning, were the conditions of the early Earth complex or disorganized and primitive? While creation says that there were already complex conditions, whereas evolution says that no, things were very disorganized. So evolution says simple to complex, creation says complex to simple. So I have to interpret things according to my presuppositions, simple to complex or complex to simple. So according to creation, there were many types of living things at the beginning, and they began in a complex, fully functional condition. Why? Because there is an intelligent being that brought things into existence in a complex, fully functional condition. Changes would damage genetic information rather than adding to it. Mutations, that is, copying mistakes, should be harmful. So there should be mechanisms to minimize mutations. There should not have been any new major types that have come into existence since the beginning, and many have gone extinct. Notice I didn't mention Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, original sin. That's part of it, but that's not all. There are certainly some scientific aspects to creation. Well, likewise, evolution, it says the opposite. It says the first living thing was a single cell. It was far simpler than anything known today. So as it and its descendants reproduced, they experienced many copying mistakes, that is, mutations, in their DNA. Many of these obviously must have been beneficial because the first living thing would not have had heart, lungs, blood, kidneys, brain, and so forth. So many of the mutations must have been beneficial and added a tremendous amount of genetic information until they produced every type of living organism that's ever existed. We have a classification system that's generally used. There might be minor variations in this, but in paleontology, the highest commonly used taxonomic category is the kingdom, followed by the phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Genus and species are defined by the ability to interbreed. Can we do experiments between two dinosaur bones? No, of course not. We need something living to know whether they would interbreed. So we can't do experiments. We just have to use our opinion and say, well, this is different enough. It must have been a different genus. Perhaps not. We don't know. So the higher classifications, the higher taxa, are the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, and each one of those can be subdivided into subkingdoms, subphyla, subclasses, suborders. The lower taxonomic categories, the taxa, are family, genus, and species. And those also can be subdivided into a subfamily, subgenus, subspecies. So we humans, for instance, belong to kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, which is identified by having a segmented backbone. And so we have vertebrae. So we're part of that phylum, but we're subphylum Vertebrata. We also belong to class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae. The genus is Homo, and the species is Sapiens. Now, according to creation, initial complexity, many of the higher categories, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, and so forth, should appear in the lowest fossil-bearing layers. The numbers should actually decrease in higher layers due to extinction. According to evolution, initial disorganization, there was one living cell that belonged to one species, one class, one order, one phylum, one genus, and so forth. So at the very beginning, there was only one, and then later on, as a result of copying mistakes, it evolved, and now we had a second species. Oh, look at that, a second genus, a second family. So at the very lowest fossil-bearing layers, there should be very few of the higher categories represented, and the number should actually increase in the higher layers as more and more types evolved. This is the geologic column that is used often to tell people that the Earth is multiple millions or billions of years. Well, it's divided, though, Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and then there are periods, the Quaternary, the Tertiary, the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and so forth. Those are subdivided into epochs. We're living in the Holocene. The one layer down from us supposedly is the Pleistocene, and then the Pliocene, and so forth. So how long ago did they begin? How could you tell? You can't tell. These are things that are made up according to people's belief in evolution. This geologic column does not exist in nature. It was pieced together from many locations around the world. The overall order is fairly consistent when two or more layers are present, but every layer can be found out of order somewhere else in the world. So this does not exist in nature. It's only in the textbooks. Okay, where is the most complete segment of the geologic column? It's at the Grand Canyon. The Cenozoic is missing, the Holocene, Pleistocene, Pliocene, Miocene, and so forth. All of those are missing. The segments that are present at the Grand Canyon, we have some parts of the Precambrian, some parts of the Cambrian, some parts of the Devonian, some parts of the Mississippian, some parts of the Pennsylvanian, and some parts of the Permian. That's it. Those are not identified by radiometric dating. They're identified by the type of fossils that they contain. Many of the names of those layers were not assigned based upon anything that had to do with dating, but instead on the place where the suite of fossils were first identified. For instance, the Cambrian was first identified in Wales, part of the United Kingdom, Cambria. Ordovician is from the ancient Ordovician lands, Silurian from the land of the Silures, Devonian from Devonshire, England, Permian from the Russian city of Perm, Triassic from the fact that the rock layers are divided into three parts, and so forth. Guess where Pennsylvanian and Mississippian were first identified? So there are hundreds of thousands of fossil and living species that have been identified. If everything came from one original ancestor, one simple cell, which Darwin believed must have evolved at sea level as a result, in some warm little pond as a result of chemical processes, well, in order to produce all we have in the present, Darwin said, those that claim that there's mountains of fossil evidence for evolution, they need to listen to what Darwin said. But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation in every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against the theory. Darwin was writing in the mid 1800s, approximately 1860 or thereabouts, and he said, yes, I know there should have been tremendous numbers of fossil transitions, and we don't have them. But I think as we dig up more fossils, we will find the transitions. That's the most obvious and gravest objection. So Darwin said the fossils are the best objection against his theory of evolution. Well, have we found all of the transitional fossils? No. Since the 1860s, there have been billions and billions of fossils dug up so far. In fact, in South Africa, the Karoo Formation, which I was privileged to go to, this one formation alone is estimated to contain hundreds of billions, that's billions with a B, of vertebrate fossils. So how many fossils would it take for you to be able to draw reasonable conclusions? Hundreds? No, not enough. Thousands? No, not enough. Tens of thousands? Maybe. Hundreds of thousands, getting there. Millions? Oh, yeah, okay. Hundreds of millions? Yes. How about billions? There have been fossils classified into about 250,000 species, so there should be millions of transitional forms. Darwin has not been vindicated. There are only a few fossils that have been proposed as transitions between any two higher categories. Even those are highly disputed. When I say only a few, maybe 10, maybe a few dozen fossil types have been proposed as transitions between two higher categories. Even those, if you read the technical journals, are highly disputed among paleontologists. So Darwin said in the 1860s, and I agree, the fossil record remains the most obvious and gravest objection to the neo-Darwinian model of evolution, slow, steady, gradual evolution. So the lack of transitions has actually led many to adopt a new model of evolution called punctuated equilibria, which says rather than slow, steady, gradual change, there were sudden jumps. The fossils, the living creatures, stayed essentially the same for many, many, many years and were preserved as fossils. And then some sort of an event happened to punctuate that. Perhaps a meteor impact, volcanic eruption, something like that. It punctuated the equilibrium, so it's called punctuated equilibria. So creation, which I identify as initial complexity, complex to simple, relies upon logical as well as religious arguments. So I'm not going to mention Adam and Eve and so forth. Not going to mention the Bible, even though I believe every word of it. If life were developing gradually, according to initial complexity, there would be far more transitional fossils than final forms or terminal forms. However, almost no transitional fossil types have been identified, perhaps a few dozen. So therefore, a logical argument would say that it surely looks like life did not develop gradually. Now, what are the arguments against that? The arguments for some sort of evolution. These are not scientifically, these are philosophical. So first, anything that cannot be scientifically tested cannot be allowed as a possibility. Well, that's ridiculous. That would say that we know everything. I don't think we do. There are many aspects of evolution, initial disorganization, that can't be scientifically tested either. So initial disorganization, evolution, objects because initial complexity creation depends upon God and therefore cannot be scientifically tested. Well, so what? So therefore, we cannot allow initial complexity as a possible explanation for everything. Here we go. once again, stuck. Okay, now the arguments for slow, steady, gradual evolution, neo-Darwinism. Number one, we take as a postulate evolution must be true. So while offspring vary somewhat from their parents, the differences are not that drastic. Therefore, evolution must have worked by the slow accumulation of gradual changes over billions of years. What are the arguments against that? Number one, if the transitions had been gradual, there should be far more transitional types than terminal types. There should be something on the way up to becoming a dog or a cat or a human, any number of things. There should be far more transitions than final or terminal forms. But out of hundreds of thousands of fossil types identified, at least 250,000, only a few dozen are even claimed to be transitions from one major type to another. So this would be used as an argument that says evolution did not occur by gradual transitions. Let me give you an example of one excuse for the lack of transitional fossils. Some neo-Darwinists excuse the lack of fossils by saying that perhaps the sedimentary rocks were incapable of preserving fossils. However, if you look at the right there, you'll see some jellyfish, fossil jellyfish. What's softer than a jellyfish? Nothing. It's mainly water. While there are well-preserved Ediacaran jellyfish that on the evolutionary timescale are dated at over 550 million years old. And hundreds of the largest fossil jellyfish ever discovered are located in Wisconsin in sediments that are supposed to be 510 million years old. If the rocks could preserve jellyfish, they ought to be able to preserve anything. Now, there's another model about evolution. It says punctuated equilibria that says that evolution was sudden jumps rather than slow, steady, gradual change. So this is based upon the same logical axiom postulate that evolution must be true. Okay, so the reason for this is the extreme rarity of transitions in the fossil record argues strongly against neo-Darwinian, that is, gradual evolution. And there's only one other alternative, punctuated equilibria, only other evolutionary alternative, so therefore it must be true. What are the arguments against this? Well, the first living thing would have had no heart, lung, brain, blood, anything like that. But nowadays we look throughout the world, in the living world and the fossil record, and we find tremendous differences between the very earliest things. So the arguments against punctuated equilibria are, number one, no mutations are known to increase genetic information. Number two, okay, if we've got a little boy worm and it's going to evolve, it needs a little girl worm. I shouldn't have used an example of worms, but a little boy bird, a little girl bird are necessary. We have to have a male and female of each transitional type. They would each need hundreds of beneficial mutations. So the story I heard was that one day a reptile laid an egg and a bird hatched. That was put out by a German evolutionary biologist. Well, if that's the case, we're going to have, besides just the one reptile that laid an egg, we need something to fertilize that egg. We need a male to go along with the female. And the female is going to have to undergo a tremendous number of beneficial mutations to switch to the reptilian type egg. And then we're going to have a male that has a reproductive system capable of fertilizing that egg. Now, not only that, these two would have to live at the same time and in the same place. It doesn't do any good for one to be in Europe and one in North America. And in order for the babies to be able to breed only with each other, the male and female are going to have large numbers of babies to breed only with each other. And we've got this happened, okay? Now we've got a bird. Yes, but what about all of the other hundreds of thousands of fossil and living species? This has to happen hundreds of thousands of times for each evolving line, not just reptiles and birds. But for every new step of evolution, this is going to happen thousands of times. So far, we've identified about 250,000 fossil species. At most, a few dozen have been proposed as transitions. Even those are not unanimously accepted, even among evolutionists. So, initial complexity creation says the transitions were not preserved because they never existed. Neo-Darwinism, slow, steady, gradual, says the transitions were not preserved because the process was too slow. Punctuated equilibria says the transitions were not preserved because the process was too fast. The common thread is that the transitions were not preserved. If you look around the world, you'll see that there are huge numbers of fossil graveyards. Up at the upper left, there's a picture of that I took in South Africa at the Karoo supergroup, which is estimated to contain hundreds of billions of vertebrate fossils. That's a Bradysaurus. There's a bunch of Bradysauruses, if you remember the Brady Bunch. Okay, upper right, Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. It contains thousands of dinosaur skeletons. Lower left, that's the Lance Creek Formation that I told you I got that fossil at. You can get involved in that and go dig fossils any summer you want, and you are guaranteed you're going to find some dinosaur bones. There's an Edmontosaurus herd estimated at over 30,000 individuals. That's a lot of creatures. A lot of people will tell you, the evolutionists, that something is walking along next to a body of water and it dies, falls in, gets covered over with sediment, and eventually the sediment wears away. Okay, fine. I might be able to swallow that for one individual, but not 30,000 in the same place. And then the Grand Canyon's red wall limestone down in the center, it's estimated to contain billions of nautiloid fossils, sea creatures. So fossils are most often found in large groups. In many cases, they're found in a group that's known as a suite of fossils, and the suites of fossils are used to identify the rock layers in which they're found, the strata in which they're found. There are, oops, sorry about that. Pardon me for being a little bit goofy with my computer. Okay, the idea of creation, initial complexity, says that the strata that contain a large number of fossils were probably formed under catastrophic conditions. A great deal of sediment was deposited around the Earth in violent events, such as floods and volcanic ash eruptions. The opposite idea, remember, initial complexity is creation, which involves flooding. The opposite idea, evolution, initial disorganization, says sediments were deposited a tiny bit at a time over millions of years, and then eventually the sediment consolidated into rock. The principle behind this is called uniformitarianism. It says the present is the key to the past. That is, there's never been a worldwide flood. And there's a principle commonly called Steno's law of superposition, says that the layers on the bottom have to be the oldest. Is that necessarily true? No, there's a very outstanding series of videos that you can go look up on YouTube. It's called Drama in the Rocks. And it shows that now what's at the bottom is not necessarily the oldest. But uniformitarianism is a statement of faith by geologists. It says the present is the key to the past. How do you know that? This is what Peter warned us about in the last days. He said, first of all, you must understand this, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own passions and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things have continued as they were from the beginning of creation. They, the scoffers, deliberately ignore this fact that by the word of God, heavens existed long ago and an earth formed out of water and by means of water, through which the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. That is, scoffers will say there's never been a worldwide flood. That's the basis of the geologic timescale. Well, is there anything that's happened within recent memory that would show us that geologic features can form rapidly, rather than slowly? I'm so glad you asked that question. This is a picture of Mount St. Helens, which it was a classic snow-capped mountain in southwest Washington state before it erupted in 1980. The ages that are assigned to Steno, according to Steno's law of superposition, which was formulated in the 1600s, says that an undisturbed rock strata, the oldest rocks are at the bottom. It's not a law. It's been falsified. I want to show you that this so-called law applies only when the sediment is deposited under very, very, very quiet conditions, quiescent conditions. But the mud flows at Mount St. Helens show that if the sediment is moving, the bottom layers may not be the oldest. These are some sedimentary layers that were laid down by Mount St. Helens in 1980. The eruption produced vast and fast mud flows that deposited hundreds of feet of finely laminated sediments into the North Fork of the Toutle River in just a few days. So if you look at those where I was pointing out those layers, it didn't take 100,000 years for one layer to get set down and then 100,000 years for another. No, there were hundreds of feet deposited in one single day. And then a bit later, there were hundreds more of feet of sediment deposited in one day. And then afterward, if you look at the area that's circled in red, you'll see that there's a canyon there. It's commonly called Engineer's Canyon. So when the eruption filled the Toutle River Valley with hundreds of feet of superheated mud, it rapidly hardened into rock. So just about 2 years later, there was a second eruption that sent more superheated mud blasting through the new sedimentary rock. It formed a network of canyons up to 160 feet deep. That's 1/35th the scale of the Grand Canyon. How long did it take? 1 day. The Toutle River did not carve the canyons, it simply drains the canyons. And so you say, well, sedimentary rock, that's soft rock. Okay, let me show you some hard rock. That's a picture I took at Mount St. Helens. That's called the Goat Rocks. Hard rock erosion is supposed to take at least millions of years, but there was a steam blast during the eruption of Mount St. Helens. It carved out a 700-foot deep canyon through solid granite in one afternoon. It doesn't take billions of years. So this is what I want to recommend that you go to. Look in YouTube, Drama in the Rocks by, I believe it was Peter Wilders that did this. I'm sorry, Guy Berthaud and Pierre Julien at Colorado State University. They found, by doing experiments in a lab, that layers formed by flowing sediment look like those that form quietly, except the layers are not oldest at the bottom. If there's a rapid current flow, we're going to get multiple layers, but they were all deposited at the same time. So the oldest ones are in the direction that the current came from rather than chronologically the oldest. So the eruption and the later mud flows at Mount St. Helens confirm that Steno's law of superposition does not apply to fast flowing sediment. Hundreds of feet of mud deposited tens of thousands of finely laminated strata, and they were essentially the same age. So we've got different beliefs about how fossils were formed. There have been hundreds of billions of fossils identified around the world. According to creation, initial complexity, how were they formed? Living things came into existence in a complex condition, so they didn't take millions of years to develop into the terminal forms in the fossil record. Animals and plants buried quickly enough could become fossils under the right conditions. That is, you have to have sediment, you have to have heat and pressure, and you have to have the right minerals. Okay, those are the conditions under which something could be fossilized. And we would think If you believe your Bible, you're going to see that there was definitely one worldwide flood. So many of the fossils were probably produced as a result of catastrophic processes. There have also been fossils produced in small local areas, not worldwide, but things like crude oil and so forth. According to evolution, initial disorganization, animals and plants evolved over billions of years. So, as sediment was accumulated in the bodies of water, animals and plants dying next to them fell in and were buried. That sediment eventually hardened into rock. After millions of years, the rock eroded and exposed the fossils. Well, here's an experiment you can try. Go out and find a cat, shoot the cat, throw it in the lake, see if it turns into a fossil. That's a terrible thing for me to say. See if it turns into a fossil. No, it's going to get eaten by scavengers. You have to cut it off from contact with the oxygen and with the scavengers. Otherwise, it'll never turn into anything. So you have to bury something quickly so it doesn't rot. You have to make sure that you have the right kind of minerals in the mud or water, and you have to apply a lot of heat and pressure. So how long does this take? How many millions of years? This experiment has been done on chicken bones many, many, many times. And it turns out that chicken bones can turn into mineralized fossils in 5 to 10 years. There have been bones and insects and resin that have been turned into what looks just like a fossil in a single day. Organic garbage, such as banana peels and grass clipping, has been turned into crude oil, otherwise known as fossil fuel, in as little as 20 minutes. And you say, well, that's the solution to our energy problem. No, it's not. You need to put these under tremendous heat and pressure. So you lose an awful lot of energy radiating out into space. But the Earth was furnishing the heat and pressure. So we didn't need to do it. And then I showed you the picture of the spark plugs. Those are often used as fishing sinkers. It has such a high concentration of minerals. They can become coated with minerals and look like fossils in just a few years. So where do we find this geologic column? Nowhere. It's pieced together from many locations around the world. When more than one stratum is present, the order is fairly consistent worldwide, but you don't find the whole thing anywhere. Every layer can be found out of order somewhere in the world. So according to initial complexity creation, although they might not have all been preserved as fossils, all of the major types of animals and plants were present almost from the beginning. There should be many, many major types in the lowest fossil-bearing records. We would think that the majority of fossils were probably formed under catastrophic conditions, such as one or more floods and volcanic ash flows. Animals and plants in the world today live in interdependent communities, ecological communities called biomes. We expect that the fossil record should hint that prehistoric conditions were similar. So we expect to find a clear-cut worldwide pattern of fossil distribution indicating distinct ecological communities. Do these exist in the world? Of course. In Colorado alone, there are 8 ecosystems. There are many, many, many. The factors involved in determining an ecosystem or biome vary with climate, elevation above or below sea level, temperature, and many things like that. So in the world today, there are several dozen distinct biomes. Well, guess what? In the fossil record, there are several dozen distinct biomes also. Now, evolution, initial disorganization, says that the very first living thing belonged to one kingdom, one phylum, class, one order, family, genus, species, and so forth. So its descendants diverged into more and more types as time went on. Strata represent time periods. Fossils on the bottom are the oldest. Fossils should increase in complexity as we go higher in the geologic column. And most fossils were formed slowly, steadily, and gradually under uniformitarian conditions. No flood. And since there are random mutation rates in living things, animals and plants in North America should have been evolving differently than those in Africa, those in Asia, those in Europe, and so forth. Animals and plants would have evolved at different rates at different times in different places. There should be no clear-cut pattern of ecological communities worldwide. But how do we identify rocks? Well, there are different types of organisms, from bacteria to humans, that would have had to evolve at different rates in different places at different times. There should be no worldwide pattern of clearly defined communities of fossils, but that's precisely how we identify rocks. People don't use, evolutionists don't use radiometric dating. They identify each rock layer, such as Cambrian, Ordovician, and so forth, by a clearly defined suite of fossils that's essentially the same no matter where in the world you find it. The age of the rocks is determined by the fossils they contain, and the age of the fossils is determined by the rocks in which they're found. Remember, the Grand Canyon is the single most complete section of the geologic column in the entire world. It contains only 6 of the strata. And the gap from Cambrian to Devonian is supposed to represent over 70 million years of missing fossils. And then likewise, the gap from Permian to Triassic is missing a tremendous amount of fossil evidence. So think about this. I mentioned earlier, Darwin believed that life must have come into existence in some warm little pond. Well, that has been formalized into what's called the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, which we talked about in an earlier lesson. So most textbooks present some form of the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis. This implies that life began around sea level over 3 billion years ago because you needed to have the right nutrients, the right chemicals, the right energy source, and so forth. However, the ones that are supposed to be the oldest of all the Precambrian fossils are ocean bottom dwelling creatures. They're supposed to be the oldest. So some living thing comes into existence at sea level. Why would they decide, let's dive many miles to get down to the bottom of the ocean and then begin to evolve back up over billions of years? Well, how would they survive? How would they survive the dive? So let me give you a quick contrast about beliefs of what we ought to find in the fossil record. According to creation, initial complexity, the rock strata probably represent ecological communities. There should be a pattern of clearly defined fossil communities around the world. Initial disorganization, evolution, says the strata instead represent time periods. There should be a continual overlap of life forms with no consistent worldwide patterns. Different things would evolve at different rates at different times in different places. Creation says suites of fossils are how we identify each stratum, each rock layer. So what we observe in the rocks is exactly what initial complexity led us to expect. Evolution says the consistent worldwide pattern of fossil suites identifying strata requires a great deal of explanation in order to fit with evolution disorganization. So what we expect according to creation is that there would be a sudden appearance. The specimen, when they're preserved as fossils, the specimens of each basic kind found lowest in the rocks should appear suddenly with all of their identifying characteristics, the ordinal characters, those things that identify a cat as a cat, a dog as a dog, and so forth. They should be found in the very lowest representative of each major type. Nothing should be halfway to becoming a dog, 3/4 of the way to being a human, and so forth. There's a second phenomenon that says once they got there, they shouldn't change. This is called stasis. Each type of organism was brought into existence in a fully functional condition. So there should be a resistance to basic change. Now, I'm not talking minor things like hair color and things like that, but basic change in the overall structure of the type. So the fossils of those at the bottom should be recognizable as the same basic type from the lowest appearance until the present, the highest layers, or until extinction. Evolution says a very different thing. It says the first living thing evolved from lifeless chemicals over 3 billion years ago. Ever since then, its descendants have continually evolved by copying mistakes, mutations, into more and more complex types. Since there would have had to be so many transitions during the development into each terminal form, 250,000 terminal forms, there should be far more transitional types, millions and millions, as compared to terminal forms. And evolution also would tell us once the first recognizable terminal form of each type appeared, there'd be no reason for its descendants to stop evolving. So the fossil record should show continually gradual change. Because of the fact that that doesn't happen, there's a newer model of evolution called punctuated equilibria. It was proposed because of the sudden appearance and stasis that are so obvious in the fossil record. Those that believe in punctuation reject the initial complexity model because it requires God, some influence outside nature. So the arguments used for punctuated equilibria as opposed to gradualism are largely the same thing as the arguments for creation. The fossils indicate stasis because they were in a period of equilibrium for millions of years. And the equilibria were punctuated by sudden events such as floods, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and so forth that radically changed the environments. So new types had to evolve rapidly as a result of the altered natural selection pressure. So it was such a fast process that very few fossils of the transitions were formed. So neo-Darwinism says they weren't formed because it was too slow. Punctuated equilibria says they weren't formed because it was too fast. So this is Professor Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard. He was a staunch evolutionist. He hated when creationists quoted him, but how can we help it? This is so good. He said in Natural History magazine, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. The history of most fossil species includes two features inconsistent with gradualism. Number one, stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. And sudden appearance in any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. He hated when guys like me quoted him, but he's telling the truth. Okay, so let's talk about just a few of these specific examples. At the bottom, the Ediacaran fauna were named for the Ediacara Hills of Australia, supposedly hundreds of millions of years old. I'm sorry, billions. Hundreds of millions going into the billions. Okay. The Ediacaran fauna, first identified in Australia, they're supposed to have existed, the times are supposed to have existed for almost 4 billion years. During that time, the fossil record consisted mainly of single-celled organisms such as blue-green algae. Suddenly, in the Ediacaran layers, there are three distinct groups of complex invertebrates: worms, corals, and jellyfish. These do not gradually blend into any other type of worms, corals, and jellyfish at higher levels. They appear suddenly, fully formed, no known ancestry, and then they disappear. They have so many differences from specimens dated later that they're not believed to be ancestors of anything else later. Let's talk about the Cambrian. Precambrian rocks are supposed to represent about 4 billions of fossils. They consist mainly of microorganisms, blue-green algae, and the invertebrates found in the Ediacaran fauna. But then suddenly, in the Cambrian explosion, we find representatives of all of the phyla of the animal kingdom and many divisions of plants as well. They appear suddenly and fully formed with no transitions leading up to them. None of the Precambrian fossils is considered an ancestor for any of the Cambrian fossils. Initial disorganization evolution has a hard time explaining the Cambrian explosion. Initial complexity says, oh, this was mainly an ecological community or several ecological communities. It shows the vast diversity of life at the bottom of the early ocean. The fossils were buried under water deposited sediment in some great catastrophe. I can think of a great catastrophe. Can you? So the Cambrian explosion included a great many different types of things. There were, well, you can look and see what some of them look like. They included a whole bunch of invertebrates, sponges, uh, crinoids, echinoderms, worms, bivalves similar to oysters, and algae, which is similar to modern seaweed, and trilobites. Trilobites are one of the identifying creatures of the Cambrian explosion. So, where are their ancestors? There are none known. All the Cambrian animals and plants appear suddenly and fully formed, nothing leading up to them to indicate that there were billions of years of evolution going on before they came to be. But there are not very many fish found in the Precambrian. There are a significant number in the Cambrian, but why? Well, why, according to initial complexity creation, we have to remember that this includes catastrophism. Oh, yeah, I believe in a worldwide flood. So, except for fish, most creatures living at the bottom of the ocean are not very mobile. Fish are. So, those living at the bottom, immobile ones, would have been buried first in some sort of catastrophic event. The lowest fossils should generally have been those who were fairly dense and were not very mobile. Fish are present in the lowest ocean biomes today, so they were probably there from the beginning, but they can swim around. They're much more mobile than the bottom dwelling invertebrates. So they would have been able to escape being buried longer than the invertebrates, though there might be a few fish buried in the lowest strata. So then when you come up from the Precambrian to the Cambrian and so forth, we're going to find that these represent oceanic biomes, communities that live under the ocean at shallower and shallower depths. So as catastrophic sediment deposition continued, more and more fish would have been unable to escape being buried. And that's what we find when we come up from the Cambrian to the Ordovician, Devonian, and so forth. You find a lot of fish. How about land plants? According to evolution, land plants did not evolve for billions and billions of years. Well, all of the Cambrian animals that we found so far are types we'd expect to find in the sea. But there have been a number of sources that have reported the discovery of spores and other parts of land plants in Cambrian rocks. Land plants are not supposed to have evolved until perhaps 100 million years after the end of the Cambrian. The fossils we find of those plants are 100 million years too early. Now, initial disorganization, evolution, says the fossils were somehow reworked downward through the rocks and wound up on the bottom. Creation, initial complexity, says strata were often formed under catastrophic conditions. There would have been a great deal of turbulence in the water, so it wouldn't be surprising to find plants occasionally mixed in with animals outside their normal biome because of the violent water action. Look at the kinds of things that you find in the world today. These are sea creatures. This pales in comparison to what you find in the Cambrian and the Precambrian, especially the Cambrian explosion. Most of these are now extinct. That means at the very beginning, there was an incredible diversity of life. Is that more compatible with simple to complex, as evolution says, or complex to simple, as creation says? There are let's go on to land and let's talk about mammals. Scientists can tell the difference between reptiles and mammals by looking at the bones and between different types of mammals by the bone structure. There are no mammals known from any stratum lower than the Triassic. There are only a few things called stem mammals that are found in the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. There's no visible evolutionary development from lower to upper strata. All of a sudden, in the lower Paleogene, there are 27 orders, approximately, depends on who you're talking to, who's classifying it, but 27 orders of mammals appear suddenly in the lower Paleogene. Well, initial disorganization, evolution, says the extra orders evolved by natural selection operating on minor mutation. Initial complexity says, no, they were not new orders. They were existing ones belonging to biomes that had not been previously buried and fossilized at lower levels. So as I mentioned before about Stephen Jay Gould, he talks about the extreme rarity of transitional forms, the fact that they don't change, they appear suddenly. So besides the fact that the fossils don't show directional change from lower to higher strata, there are dozens of so-called living fossils known. For instance, you can see stromatolites, blue-green algae, that are dated about 3.5 billion years old. They're the same today. They haven't evolved in 3.5 billion years. So blue-green algae haven't evolved, shrimp haven't evolved, horseshoe crabs haven't evolved. The coelacanth, which is a fish that was thought to be extinct, oh, they haven't evolved either in supposedly 75 million years. So let me give you a brief summary of the expectation. According to creation, we expect catastrophism. According to evolution, we expect uniformitarianism. Creation says strata represent ecological communities. We should see a pattern of clearly defined such communities around the world. Evolution says, no, they represent time periods. So since things were evolving at different rates, at different places, at different times, there should be no consistent worldwide patterns. But yet that's exactly how we identify the rock layers. According to creation, many of the higher categories, kingdom, phylum, class, and so forth, should appear in the lowest fossil-bearing rocks. Because of extinction, that number should decrease through time. Evolution says, oh, the very first living thing belonged to one kingdom, phylum, class, and so forth. So the number of those higher taxa should increase through time. Creation says the exceptions to the usual order of burial would probably be because of violent water action. Evolution says exceptions to the usual order of burial would probably have been because of geologic reworking. Creation expects sudden appearance of each basic type. Evolution says, no, that shouldn't happen. We should see a gradual development. Creation says once they arrive, they're going to stay basically the same. Evolution says, no, they should continually and consistently show a gradual, hit the wrong button, sorry about that. They should continually show a gradual change as we move from higher to higher to higher strata. Well, as I said at the beginning, people spend their entire career studying paleontology. I've given you just a tiny bit of invertebrate paleontology. Please, by all means, read the material that includes in this class, the Liberty Ministry College, or on my website, creationorevolution.net. That's my information. And you go to creationorevolution.net, look for the link that says creation teaching materials. Okay, let's go over some of the review questions. These are what you'll be tested on for this chapter. The study of paleontology is not part of empirical science. It's considered part of the what sciences. According to creation, initial complexity, would the first members of any group of living things been recognizable as that group? And would they have necessarily looked like any of the modern forms? According to creation, a great many different types of living things were brought into existence around the same time through some unknown, non-natural process. This would lead us to expect that the number of higher categories might have done what through time, or from rock layers from the bottom to the top. According to evolution, one single type of living thing came into existence through some unknown natural process, probably at sea level. This would lead us to expect that the number of higher taxonomic categories would have done what through time. Where is the single most complete portion of the geologic column known in the entire world? Next question kind of gives it away. The Grand Canyon contains how many strata? Distinct strata. Each geologic stratum is identified by a characteristic group of fossils known as a what? Many something or others of the strata on the geologic columns are based on where the suites were first located. Darwin wrote that the fossil record was the most obvious and gravest what to his theory. Out of about 250,000 fossil species identified, how many are claimed to be transitions from one major type to another? Neo-Darwinism says transition were not preserved because evolution was too what? Punctuated equilibria says transitions were not preserved because evolution was too what? Creation says transitions were not preserved. Why? What's this fancy word based on uniformitarianism that says fossils were formed slowly and gradually over millions of years? What, on the other hand, says most of the fossils were probably produced as a result of Noah's flood. Eruptions of Mount St. Helens in 1980 shows that processes with thought to take millions of years can occur in a few whats under catastrophic conditions. Experiments have shown that bones can turn into well-mineralized fossils in a few whats. And experiments have shown that under the right conditions, plant debris, banana peels, grass clippings, and so forth, can turn into a fairly good grade of crude oil in less than what? Creation interprets the suites of fossils as ecological communities or whats. Evolution, instead, interprets the suites of fossils as what? Darwin believed that life began in some warm little pond. The fossils supposed to be the oldest are supposed to live at the bottom of the whats. How is that a problem? Two of the most obvious characteristics of the fossil record are what, which is sudden, what kind of appearance, and resistance to basic change, which is known as what? Are there any known ancestors for the Ediacaran animals? They were animals. Are there any known transitions leading from them to the Cambrian? Okay, so you ready for some answers? Memorize these, love them, learn them. The study of paleontology, fossils, is not part of empirical science. It must be considered part of the what? The historical sciences. That means we can't directly test it. According to the initial complexity creation model, would the first members of any group of living things have been recognizable as that group? Yes, they would have all of their ordinal characters, their identifying characters present from the very beginning. Would they necessarily have looked that much like any modern forms? Well, no, not really. According to creation, a great many types of living things were brought into existence around the same time through some unknown non-natural process, where evolution says unknown natural process. So creation would lead us to expect that the number of higher categories, kingdom, phyla, and so forth, would have very likely decreased due to extinction over time. According to evolution, some single type of living thing came into existence through some unknown natural process. So it belonged to one kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So we would expect, according to evolution, the number of higher categories would have increased through time until we have all that we see in the fossil record and in the world today. The single most complete portion of the geologic column in the entire world is at the Grand Canyon. It contains only 6 of the strata. Each geologic layer, each stratum, is identified by a characteristic group of fossils known as a suite, S-U-I-T-E, like a hotel suite. Many of the names of the strata on the geologic column are based on where the suites of fossils were first located. Darwin wrote not that the fossil record proved this theory, but that the fossil record was the most obvious and gravest objection to his theory. Out of about 250,000 fossil species identified, how many are claimed to be transitions from one major type to another? At most, only a few dozen. Neo-Darwinism, slow, steady, gradual processes, says the transitions were not preserved because evolution was too slow. The other evolutionary model, punctuated equilibria, says the transitions were not preserved because they were too fast. Creation says the transitions were not preserved because they never existed. All 3 of them, no transitions. Which one makes more sense? What evolution, based on uniformitarianism, says fossils were formed slowly and gradually over millions and millions of years? That's evolution. Creation says most of the fossils, maybe not all, but most of the fossils were probably produced as a result of Noah's flood. The eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 shows that processes that were thought to take millions of years can occur in a few days or weeks under catastrophic conditions. Come on. Experiments have shown that bones can turn into well-mineralized fossils in just a few years. Not only bones, experiments have also shown that under the right conditions, plant debris can turn into crude oil in less than 1 day, in fact, less than 20 minutes under the right conditions. Creation interprets the suites of fossils as ecological communities or biomes. Evolution interprets the suites of fossils as representing time periods. Darwin believed that life began in some warm little pond by something similar to the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis. He didn't attempt to identify what, but he said it's a warm little pond. So the fossils, in contrast to what Darwin believed, the fossils that are supposed to be the oldest are supposed to have lived at the bottom of the ocean. So that's a problem because the first living things would have come alive at sea level. Then they had to dive several miles down to the bottom of the ocean without being killed by the pressure, by the difference in salinity, and all of those other factors. 2 of the most obvious characteristics of the fossil record are what and what? Sudden appearance of each type and a resistance to basic change known as stasis. What are the ancestors of the Ediacaran animals? Are there any known? No. Are there any known transitions from the Ediacaran to the Cambrian, whether animals or plants? Nope. Is that it? That must be it. Well, gentlemen, ladies, I hope that this is going to do you some good. This is something I've been studying for many years, and I can't present a lot of the stuff I've learned in such a short period of time. So please, I encourage you to go back to the Liberty Ministry College Moodle or to mycreationorevolution.net website and download the text because it's got a whole lot more than what I was able to include in this class. Okay, well, that's it. May God bless you.